Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Coach Tyler here with the fabulous Dr. Lisa.
Hey there.
Every time I say fabulous, you smirk and turn away. You are fabulous.
Still accepting compliments, working on it.
Hey, yeah, that is hard for a lot of people, right?
It is.
Well, I'm happy today because we have someone who's going to tie together some really interesting practices, right? And she's a specialist in body image coding. Sorry. She's a specialist in body image coaching and eating disorder recovery and binge eating. And so we're going to tackle some of those subjects today. And I think it's going to be really interesting for our listeners. So I'd like to welcome Stefanie Michele. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you guys for having me.
Of course. Yeah. So Stefanie, maybe you could start by just describing to our listeners what it is that you do and maybe how you got there.
Oh, that's a long story, but I will try to condense it for you.
You've got
Oh God, oh my God, that's a challenge. So I work primarily with people who have a history of binge-restrict cycles in particular, but also all manner of eating disorders, orthorexia, anorexia, and compensatory binging and purging and things like that, which goes hand in hand with body image. And those two things were personal experiences of mine, personal struggles of mine for well over 2 decades of my life. And I'm sitting here today in a recovered place, which was a place I never thought I would get to. And as I was moving through my own recovery, I said to myself, if I ever actually get on the other side of this, I want to help other people do that. And at the time, I was an occupational therapist, and I was working primarily with, actually not even with sensory issues and things with kids, which was part of my nervous system regulation background, but I was working mostly with neurological patients in brain trauma and things like that. And I ended up kind of leaving that career to end up helping other people with this. And since then, I've been working alongside of, I also am certified in somatic experiencing to also work on the nervous system portion of things and how those things apply to binge eating recovery, eating disorder recovery, and body image.
I love that.
Yeah, that's a nice connection. I know you talk about, in your work, I know we talked about this before we started recording, you being a physical therapist and you being an occupational therapist. How does that work really overlap for you with helping you, help these clients? I know there's so much more to it. I'll definitely want to get into the nervous system piece of it, but how did that work kind of overlap for you to make that transition? I know you had your own personal story, but how did that sort of connect the dots for you?
Well, part of the reason that I went into occupational therapy was because I found that my own mind was preventing me from being present in my day-to-day. And there was something, occupational therapy actually started in mental health, which it's no longer really applicable there, but that was its origins. And so when I went into occupational therapy, it was kind of to do the mental health component of things and to do group work and to work on limiting beliefs and the cognitive side of things, because I myself at the time was feeling like I just couldn't be in my life. I was always in my head. And that appealed to me so strongly. And even the integration of the body, because I was such an intellectualizer and, in eating disorders and body image work, we are cut off from the neck down. And so I think there was almost like a subconscious appeal to move towards occupational therapy, which has its overlaps, of course, with physical therapy and just integrating the body into the lived experience. Moving through occupational therapy and learning about things like overstimulation, from the sensory perspective with kids, which is a large part of what OTs do, but also neuroplasticity and rehabilitation of the body. But I saw how powerfully the mind was connected to that, and also just using the way that we can learn, and the way that we can learn to do things differently and to do to regenerate parts of our body that maybe seemed broken or have been diagnosed as broken, and to find different ways of kind of thriving through that.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is you said something there that, we're cut off from the neck down, especially when people in recovery, people who are really struggling, it oftentimes feels like we don't have a deep connection to our bodies, right? Yeah. And can you unpack that a little bit more? What does that mean? How do people understand if that's them? Right? Because I know, myself, I've had a floating head for a good portion of my life, and then realize my body. And what's interesting is when that happens, you start to be able to see the people around you that are just the floating heads and they can't rock and connect. So how do people feel that experience and understand that's them? And then how do they start to reconnect with their body?
Well, first of all, I want to say, I don't want to give the mind a bad rap because I love being in my head. I love to figure things out and intellectualize things and put dots together. I love to read a good self-help book and listen to podcasts and think about everything. But I think that we've got a tendency, just culturally as a kind of a generalization, to stay just there. And the telltale for that is lots of rumination, lots of overanalysis, lots of thinking, but not feeling like something is true. So in the case of, for example, body image, I did all the research there was to do and in eating disorder recovery. I learned all the things and I had so much knowledge. And I think a lot of people come into, especially people who tend towards self-growth work, will have a lot of things in their head, but it doesn't translate to the embodied felt experience. So for example, I know that my body is not my worth. I know the history of fat phobia and I know why, our culture and society makes me feel like I'm an objectified failure, and I know this, but I don't feel like I can apply any of that. And that part, that feeling part is the embodied part. So it's the felt sense of something being true rather than just the cognitive sense of something being true. And I think another place where we're not embodying something is when we emotionally rationalize instead of emotionally feel, or we want to fix emotions because the emotions live in the body, thoughts live in the mind. And so if we're somebody who, we know all the things, but we're not necessarily able to apply them, or we have lots of action going on in the brain, but we're not necessarily feeling anything. If somebody asks, well, where are you noticing that in your body? Or how do you, are you even feeling angry? Anger is one that we want to dissociate from a lot. That we can't necessarily name that, or we don't know what people are talking about when they say drop into the body. We maybe cognitively understand, but we're not sure how to do it.
Yeah, that's big. And I think that you mentioned something powerful there. Most women, especially women, are taught that rage and anger are not okay. And that's one of the most suppressed emotions that I've seen in women. And it's something that I think we need to normalize as okay and teach healthy ways to express that so we don't trap it in our bodies and end up feeling that resentment and built up, pent up rage. So my question would be not just around that, but how do you get people to actually drop in? How do you get them to actually feel their bodies? Because it's such an important part. And a second part to that question, how much of the work that you do is centered around people not being able to connect with their bodies, right? When we don't feel like we can process our feelings and connect with them, we try to get rid of them. And we try to get rid of them through all kinds of means. So I'm curious about those two.
Well, I'll take the second part first. So eating disorders themselves are a way, and body image angst, they're ways that we avoid the sensations or the emotions themselves, right? So if I am feeling angry at my partner or my parent or a situation that happened at work, and I don't feel like I know how to feel angry. And again, like you said, I see this a lot. I personally actually have a healthy relationship with anger, but most of the people that I work with don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And so when even just this mild irritation comes up, it's quickly pushed back down because number one, it feels dangerous. Maybe there was a dangerous relationship with it growing up, or people who modeled aggression, which is different than anger. And we don't really learn how to cope with emotions that have such a presence in the body. And anger is one of those that has a big presence in the body. There's a fast heart rate, there's flushing, there's heat, there's contraction. And when our body starts to feel any number of those things, it automatically might feel like a threat. And so the instinct is to get that to go away because it's also not nice, quote unquote. And so where does that go is usually inside of eating disorder behavior. So binging and purging can be a huge way of translating anger. I feel like those are they're angry sort of actions at times. That's not the only way that they can manifest, but I see anger as being behind a lot of that. Restricting as well. Restricting is a way that we just shut it down and say, I don't need it, I don't have it, it's not mine, I'm not owning it. And the signs of the behaviors there, or the symptoms of those behaviors, can be the anger manifesting somehow, through the body, as can body image, like self-loathing and self-criticism, and it becomes a vehicle of our own shame. So usually when I'm meeting people who are and working people with eating disorder symptoms and body image issues, it's really quickly apparent that there are translators of emotions that we don't know how to suppress. And so how, which was going back to the first part of how to drop into the body. It's not like a one and done. It's certainly not something that, I do in a single session, but it's first paying attention to the fact that we have a body and exploring what messages we are getting from it through just, again, paying attention to it. So sometimes it's just as simple as like me stopping a client in the middle of like a story, right? And saying like, I'm doing this and I'm upset about this and I hate this. And I'm just kind of like, hold on one second. Can we just pause for a second? And even just pausing sometimes is really uncomfortable. And just lingering in that silence for a half a beat more than we want to can sort of bring up a little bit of activation. And then we say like, what are we noticing happening in the body? And somebody might say, what do you mean? And nothing. I don't notice anything. Or actually, I do notice my heart's beating. It's like, okay, can we stay with that for a second? Can we actually tolerate some of the sensations? Because the instinct usually is to just rush right through them. Like, yeah, my heart's beating, but I also want to tell you that blah, 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 and this is what's happening. Because the head is just going to want to keep taking over. So part of it is the tolerating of the discomfort and the kind of awkwardness of noticing what's going on in the body and treating it as important.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I'll never forget about 10 years ago when I first went to therapy. I was getting all flustered, and my wife was couples therapy, right? And the therapist paused me and said, "What are you feeling right now?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she slid this laminated piece of paper across with like emotions and definitions. And I'm like reading it and going, oh, I'm frustrated and angry. And, and it's just a wild experience to recognize that I think very few people have an upbringing where their parents have helped them connect with what those feelings are and how to express them in a healthy way. Yeah. And I think it sounds like that's a lot of the work that you do, is just saying pause. We could talk about what we think this is, or we can experience it. Right. And when we experience it and we name it, we can connect with it and we can move through it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I think that you're right. We are not taught to do this, but the thought of doing it is we've not built up a tolerance for being able to hold what the body is feeling. It's funny. I have 3 girls, and my youngest is 7, and she came home from school, and I was actually putting her to bed later that night, and she was talking with me through anger management. She was taught at school this technique of mountain breathing, which is just sort of this 1 to 5 sort of in breath and out breath that she had learned as part of their curriculum, which it now is a part of the curriculum, which it never was for, I don't think, any of us, as we were growing up. But they're learning it, and she was teaching it to me, and I was finding she was teaching me, because there's so much value in accepting this as something that we need to learn. And I think that there is a little bit more of a movement to feeling feelings, but there's certainly not a foundation of this, I think, for anybody maybe 30 or above, who certainly just didn't. I think there was more of a pull up your bootstraps and just deal with it kind of mentality.
Go to your room until you're you're back in your body or whatever.
Yeah. Till you can be reasonable. Till you can, and that there's like people pleasing in that, and there's performing in that, and I think that that's why this is a novel kind of thing. And oftentimes I think, it's hard to have tolerance for this work because it feels silly, or it feels like emotional, and not part of the value system that maybe we were brought up with, but is running the show if we're not paying attention to that.
That part. I think that's the important key. It's like we can ignore this stuff and just pretend it's not there, or like you said, rationalize it as like, oh, they're emotional or in a bad way. But that stuff comes back up. It comes back up in every area of our lives. And I want to sort of talk a little bit about the eating disorder piece of this, and really just, at WeShape, we do a lot of work around helping people find joyful movement, and like themselves and treat themselves with a lot of respect as they're, improving their fitness and movement habits. And I think that a lot of us, I know I was, Tyler was, many of the people that come to our community, spent a lot of time in diet culture and believing that, restriction was very, very healthy and binging was very, very normal. And it was just a part of what we did. You restricted all week, you stuck to your diet, and then on Saturday you had a big cheat day.
Yeah, let's
You
talk
went
about the cheat
hard.
day.
Yeah, like it. And
Yeah.
when you're in that culture, you think it's very healthy, very normal. People look at you and they're like, "Oh wow, you're self-disciplined. You're doing so great," and you feel good. And then you come into more knowledge. Well, we said the other day, every time I learn something new, I realize there's so much I don't know. But you come into more knowledge and you realize, like, oh my God, like I've been doing this very unhealthy thing for most of my life. And then when you try to walk away from it, it's really, really hard. And I know in your work, you talk about ways in which we still restrict and binge even and don't even necessarily know it. So I would love to talk a little bit about that from your perspective and working with this population, and then just kind of being, as someone who's had experience and just living in this world, as a part of it. So what does that look like when we're still kind of restricting, even though we think we're not?
Yeah. I think the most common way that we're restricting without knowing we are is the mental restriction. So I think about restriction in 3 different ways: the physical, mental, and the emotional. And they all can result in binge eating. But, the way that we're taught to think is, to your point, it's just normalized. It's applauded. I mean, this is what we're supposed to do. And we're a culture of Ozempic now, and of sort of feeling like it's really a moral imperative to lose weight, that this is the best thing. So this idea of, a lot of times I think with binge eating, especially, people tell me all the time and will come to me and say, I am not restricting anymore, but I don't know why I'm still binging. And come to find out, like, we're not restricting because we're not necessarily fasting anymore, or we're not eliminating carbs anymore, or we're not maybe somebody says, I binge every single day. How could I possibly be restricting? But if you're binging and you're telling yourself, I shouldn't be doing this, I shouldn't be eating, I need to get my act together tomorrow, this is not the best choice, and we're berating ourselves for the choices we're making, even as we're making those choices, that's a version of mental restriction that's probably the most insidious and the most underrepresented, right? Like, we're still having it's like perfectionism is not about doing something perfectly. It's just the idea that you should be. It's kind of like that with restriction, and how we are often wagging our finger at ourselves all day long about what we're doing. And that is a stifling, oppressive, contractive place to be in. If we're constantly like kind of on guard against our own self-judgment, then that energy is going to come out in a binge as well. And I mean, not to speak of cheat days and things like this, that is essentially a socially sanctioned binge.
It's a binge day.
It's a binge day.
Yeah.
I think people are just, it's kind of like, well, if that's what I have to do to maintain the body that I think I need to have, then that's what, that becomes kind of this crossroads of like, where does the exhaustion lie?
Yeah. I used to love my binge days. This slides us really nicely. I printed out a social media post that you did. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I'm going to read the first part, and we could touch on it because I feel like this is guiding us that direction. But it says, some of the most valuable skills in recovery, in my experience. And you wrote, dusting yourself off and getting back up again. Managing your inner critic, the one that likes to tell you stories about yourself. Gray area thinking. Learning about your primal brain and their role in protecting you. And then you went on to say, dusting yourself off and getting back up again. And if I kept reading here, I think you say dusting yourself off 4 or 5 times in this post right here. I love the repetitiveness of that, because ultimately, I think what most people think is as they go through self-improvement, it's just going to get better and better and better. And we all know that that's not the truth, that you have to face some demons along the way, that life shows up, and that one of the core skills is dusting yourself off, saying, I'm doing my best, giving yourself grace and some compassion. So, how do you help people learn these skills? Let's talk about dusting yourself off, managing the inner critic, and getting rid of that black and white thinking like we were just talking about.
Well, the getting back up again, I mean, that post I wrote specifically to be repetitive because it's probably the most important skill. Yeah. I would not be here if I had listened to my fear, which was always driving me to to run away from recovery, because in recovery we are confronting a lot of these demons and we're feeling the things, and that feels almost intuitively wrong. It feels too scary. And so the invitation is to be like, I can't do this, or this isn't worth it, and to go the other way. And I didn't have a coach helping me through this at the time, but I developed an inner voice of being able to say to myself, no, like this is not a roadblock. This is just a workaround. This is a course correct. This is something that I like. The muscle here is to keep going. That is exactly the ask, because if I don't, I'm repeating the pattern. So the way that I coach, and I do coach on a bit of a daily basis. So it's not just, I don't meet with my clients just weekly. I talk to them every day on a WhatsApp platform. And because every day we're probably thinking in recovery every day, I can't. And it's the voice of the, yes, you can. Yes, you can. This is not an emergency. We can keep going. Let's take a pause. Let's notice what's going on. Let's try it this way. Let's think about it this way. Like that kind of resilience is everything. And I don't think I've had a client who hasn't felt like not doing the work at some point when the going gets tough. And it is the getting back up again that keeps us in recovery and sees us through the other side of it. And likewise with like gray area thinking, I think the more we are getting back up again, the more we're learning that gray area thinking. We're learning to decrease the self-criticism and learn more compassion. I think those are the skills you learn in the getting back up again, because you can't.
Can you define that gray area thinking real quick, just so that people understand?
Sure. Yeah. Like I had a
maybe
client,
the opposite, right?
Oh yeah. The black and white thinking. Yeah. I had a client, leave me a message this morning telling me about her night last night, when she's a teacher and she'd had an early lunch, and she'd had a classroom the whole day, and she didn't get to eat until, later in the day. And by that time she'd had this really long gap between eating, and she'd gotten over hungry. And so she started to pick at things in her kitchen, before dinner was ready. And, she was over hungry. So her body was like, I need food. She ate some chocolates, some old, Halloween candy. She's like, I noticed that I was really hungry and dysregulated. And I kind of like, I let myself have some chocolates, and then I ended up going and setting the table, having a meal for dinner. And in the past, having those chocolates would have been like, what the hell? Like, what did I do? It's over. I ruined it. I might as well just finish the whole box of chocolates and like plow through dinner. Like, forget it, And I was like, okay, this is wonderful. You didn't there's no failing here. There's no problem with the fact that we had chocolates. It's the ability to be like, yeah, I'm having some chocolate because I'm over hungry. I got, and yes, it wasn't necessarily like what you planned to do, but it didn't derail you entirely. And it's being able to hold less perfectionism around what the ideal situation is, and to be able to speak to yourself through that. That speaks to the self-compassion piece, and to give yourself a break, talk to yourself the way you would talk to somebody else, which we are loath to do when we've made a mistake. And that's everything too.
Yeah. It's funny how perfectionism is so closely tied to black and white thinking.
And rigidity.
Right. We end up being a perfectionist, and we're going to do everything perfectly. And then today got off to a bad start, so I'm just going to eat everything that I want to eat and not
throw the whole day.
I'm not going to work out because I only have 20 minutes instead of an hour, and we end up just making decisions that are not serving us in the long run. And ultimately, if we can let go of some of that, and like you said, get into a more gray zone of thinking, oh, I had some chocolate. It was delicious. Let me move on. All of a sudden, that angst of needing to go more or needing to suppress more goes away. And we end up feeling a lot more calm in our nervous system about it.
Yes, but it's so hard. The brain would much prefer to categorize things in extremes. It's easier for it, and that's a tolerance too, of figuring out, how do I hold something that feels a little bit of this and a little bit of this? It's much more comfortable to just put them way over here so we know the difference.
Let's talk about how the primal brain is working against us. Can you share with our listeners that? I think that'll be a good place to give some people.
Oh, our poor primal brain. So our primal brain is I used to think of my primal brain as my mortal enemy, because it was the part of me that was just highly reactive, and it was the black and white thinking, and it's so defensive and so sensitive, and it's the part of us that feels threat and then responds to that threat with hyperaction. Yeah. And I now kind of think of my primal brain as a scared part of my inner child or something, a scared part of me that's just really on shaky ground about a lot of things and isn't sure that we're safe. And safety is a big part of the primal brain. I talk about safety all the time. And it doesn't mean that we don't think we're actually safe, as in no lion's actually coming, into our cave to eat us. But we feel unsafe when we don't have things necessarily like organized in nice and neat packages, or if we feel like we did eat the chocolate and now we feel discomfort in our body. And there's something about that starts to feel unsafe from the point of view of like maybe emotional safety, or like what's going to happen, what this means about my body and how it might change my body. And we read these things as emergencies, or our primal brain reads them as emergencies and then reacts to sort of overcorrect. And all of that primal working is, for some of us, and I speak for myself, I used to live just there. I only had access to that part of my brain 95% of the time. The executive functioning that could hold multiple truths and could see, in a larger picture, just wasn't available because I was always feeling like I was under threat. And we box ourselves into that threat the more we have eating disorder behaviors show up to keep us inside of that very strict definition of safety. So we're sort of we're encouraging the primal brain to stay alive the more we're feeding our symptoms. And now I forgot the question.
You're answering
it right now. Yeah, it's how the primal brain works against us.
Yeah.
Right. So because when we are under threat, and the way that we've evolved as humans is to make quick decisions, no nuance, just get it done. The black and white is relevant in emergencies, but it's not now. It's not in what we're calling emergencies, which unfortunately have become, fitting in and having bodies that match ideals. Society has really put a lot of pressure on us to hustle, to make more money, to look a certain way, and it does almost start to feel like an emergency. It feels like an emergency of belonging. And that sense is I think constantly, social media, like even something as mindlessly scrolling is convincing us that we're not doing it right. And the more that we're feeling that sense of like, I'm not right, our primal brain's being like, something's wrong, we're going to be pushed more and more into that black and white. I think what I've learned so much, and what nervous system regulation work has done for me, is to be able to de-escalate that, so that when I'm scrolling Instagram and I see who has more friends than me and who is going on more trips than me and who looks like this and who's younger than me, this is that I can notice my body starting to get like, and then I'm like, hold on. And that's where these things, the brain and the body work together. Like my body's telling me that there's a problem, but I can look at this situation and de-escalate that and like regulate myself back down to, no, there isn't. The world is convincing me there is, and it's getting worse by the day potentially. But I'm not in an emergency state, and I can think for myself, and I can have influence on my state. I'm not going to allow the world to have influence on my state anymore.
I love that. Oh.
That's a skill.
You said it feels like an emergency of belonging. I feel like that was just one of those gems that I want to repeat, because our society and our world does create that intensity for so many people. So like what tools are you helping people cultivate to understand that? Because what I'm hearing you say, and this is my own experience as well, is like, when we're running in the primal brain, we're reacting. We're just reacting. And the more we engage with these things that make us feel an emergency of belonging, the more we continue to react and stay stuck in that cycle. And it's the pause. It's the space between what are we feeling and how do I actually want to act, that we are able to create the freedom to consciously choose how we want to show up. But that is like deeply complex and challenging, right? You got to fight for every millisecond of pause. So how do you get people to find those milliseconds in the beginning?
We have to practice it, because it doesn't come naturally to us. So in sessions that when I work with people, and I know this, I always explain this to people. We might, again, read the books to understand that we should pause, but how many of us are actually doing that? I did not learn to pause until I was with my somatic therapist, who had me pause the entire hour of the session, like at different points when I was getting activated. She would have me pause, and I would not have otherwise done that. So there's something about like being almost accountable to pausing, to practice it, because it doesn't feel intuitive. But I also think when it comes to the emergency of belonging, like community is important, because if you if we're not being reminded that like we are safe, we've got people that love us, we've got people that relate to us, where a lot of us are in the same boat and don't know it, that's part of the belonging too. So if there's other people that are like, I feel like you do, you feel like I do, because I feel like the rest of the world doesn't feel like, and just to have some company that de-emergencies things. That's not a word, but it's how we feel less emergency. De-emergencies it. Because it's connection. That is really at the heart of what nervous system dysregulation is about. It's about feeling disconnected from our world, ourselves, and other people. And if we feel that we are in connection with other people, then we have the freedom to pause because we feel safe enough to, because we know that we're not alone.
I love that. I wanted to say earlier regarding like that black and white thinking, that all or nothing. It's so one of my favorite things to remind myself is more than one thing can be true.
Yeah.
More than one thing, because I thrived in black and white. Like that was my jam. Okay, this is right, this is wrong. There's nothing in between. And coming into the knowing that that's like not true was really freeing in a lot of ways. And that was like my late 30s starting to see that, like, oh, it doesn't have to be this way or the highway. It doesn't, there's not one true path to this thing. And in earlier, Tyler talking about that progression, it's like, it's not linear. It's always an up and down and a relearning and an unlearning and a relearning again. And so I just think if more people had the freedom to understand that, even though it feels safe, right, to like know what's right, know what's wrong, know what's yes, know what's no, it feels so much better. And it's so much more relaxing when you can start to live in that gray space of like, nah, there's a few possible options here.
Yeah.
There's not just one way or no way. So I really appreciate that. And I think our listeners will appreciate that as they start to hopefully live in that space and get rid of the black and white thinking for these things,
I think when we are also able to get rid of black and white thinking and live in the gray, it's like we give ourselves permission to like accept ourselves and our circumstances and be more present with that.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden what happens when we offer it to ourselves, we can give it to other people and they don't feel like they have to be perfect, black and white all the time. Right.
And that's back to the community piece because we're engaging in community and we're sharing our experiences and we're letting people know they're not alone. We've gone through this. We're going through this.
Yeah, we're here.
And then, everything just gets so much lighter, so much easier. That other way, it feels safe, but it's so stressful. It is so stressful to have that weight on you of like, did you get it right? Did you get it right?
Yeah. It's like surviving versus thriving.
Exactly.
Yeah. Funny, you mentioned the pause too, how like your therapist was the one that like made you pause. And I was having a moment there where I was like, man, I didn't even know the pause existed after 3 years of therapy with the therapist pausing me. I was like, there ain't no pause here. There's no space between thought and saying. It's just, it just happens, right?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's crazy. So, as we're coming to an end of this show, I would love to know, what are the things that you see people struggling with the most? And how do you help them overcome those things when it comes to body image? Because that's what we focus on a lot here at WeShape, is just helping people recognize when you ultimately try to use self-hatred and self-judgment to cultivate motivation, you will never be happy. You will constantly be on this downward spiral of self-hatred and self-criticism and self-judgment. But if we can start to accept and appreciate and maybe even love a little bit those parts of yourself, then all of a sudden you don't need this motivation that everyone else needs. You just start taking care of yourself because you are inherently worthy inside. Yeah. So what is it that you see people struggling with body image? And then what are the tools or the ways that you get them to start making progress towards self-acceptance?
Well, one of the things that we maybe spoke about a little earlier is that a lot of times body image thoughts and body image stress comes from dysregulation and we're projecting it onto the body. So I'm not saying that there's not a case to be made for like actual body image distress and that we're not sometimes just simply distressed about the way that we look. But I don't know if you've ever felt this before, but sometimes when we're disproportionately really like, yesterday I was all right, and today I can't stand the way that I look, that there's usually some kind of projection going on of dysregulation in the body that, again, if we're not feeling, we don't know what to do with that energy. So it gets then projected into like a really nice nest that we're familiar with and that we know the scripts for, which is, I can't stand the way I look and I need to do something about it. So that sometimes what's presenting as body image issues or body image negative self-talk is actually a whole bunch of energy, emotional energy that's looking for a place to go. So to scan when we're in a particularly heightened moment, like, is there other stuff happening that's looking for expression? Is that a time to actually drop into the body, which is when we're the least likely to do it? Is that part of what's happening here? And it's just gotten caught up in this whole cycle, that we are not even aware of. So that is happening.
So you're saying we're using body image hatred as like a stand-in for not knowing how to deal with our emotions. I think that's really interesting, because I think that a lot of the time people think that society planted this message and social media and magazines, and then they create this perfectionism. But I think that's a really interesting approach, right? Like, I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling sad, and so you're sad because you're disgusting and you need to go to the gym, right? And they're trying to deal with that sadness, but just in an unhealthy way. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. I mean, there is a case to be made of what society has planted in our, yes, 100%. Yeah. But anyone listening, like, if we reflect on, the last time that we felt uncomfortable because maybe there was a multiple truth situation going on that we didn't know how to reconcile, the discomfort of not being able to fix an emotion can become like, okay, well, it's my body. That's the problem, because that I can fix, that I can address, that I can think through. I know how to make that tangible. Like, all of a sudden, this emotional abstraction becomes this concrete problem. And we know that. We can do that in our sleep. Like, how many times have you gone through the motions of, like, hating your body, and I have to do this and I have to do that, and I know how to criticize myself, like, up every way but sideways. And so, that this is kind of a path of the nervous system that it takes to translate energy.
I'm like, this is like I'm learning something right now, because, I think of so much of this as like learned behavior, and I fully understand, and it feels very true to me that when we don't know how to process our emotions, we just do something with it. Yeah. We project it on someone else. We project it on ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really interesting thing for people to think about. Just building on that a little bit more. How do you know the difference between someone who has this inherent self-image issue because of what they've been taught, or maybe bad experiences in the past of people validating those concerns, and someone having just too much anxiety and just turning it on themselves?
Because you can have the thoughts about your body in a regulated way. So I am not saying that every single time I look in the mirror, I think wonderful things, but because I've worked really hard on not conflating my emotions with my body image distress, I know the difference between being able to objectively say, like, I'm feeling a little frustration that, this looks like this to me today, or I can't fit in this, and I don't have the privilege of that, or something like that. I can look at that from a regulated point of view and hold it. But when I'm looking in the mirror and I'm like almost disproportionately angry, or feeling this sense of injustice that feels bigger than even I can sort of wrap my head around, or it's something that's feeling really fiery and visceral, that's a cue to me that there's more going on here than there's this like problem. It's not just it's not so straightforward. There's usually visceralness attached to it. And that just to me is a flag of like, what else is going on for me? Where else am I feeling something that I don't know how to deal with, and putting it here?
So yesterday I went to this thing with my family, and my daughter, at the end it was like 6 p.m. as it was ending. It was like a little school function. My daughter tried to, scoot off with a friend, and she's like, I want to go with this friend. I'm like, maybe. And we walked over to the other parent's car, and then we realized, oh, like, this is probably not going to work out, right? So no. And she said, but I thought you said yes. And then she had this nuclear meltdown, right? So she had anger and rage, and she was expressing it. And she started yelling at my wife and yelling at me, and this is your fault, and I never get to do anything. And I just kept saying to her, if you'd like us to help you learn how to express your anger in a healthy way, we're happy to do that. Otherwise, we're just going to stay silent right now, because we don't like the way that you're throwing blame at us, right? And so, this was a tool that I'm trying to use to help my daughter understand that anger and rage should be expressed, right? Like, I have a punching bag outside, I have a wiffle ball bat. Let's go out there, let's get angry, and let's just let it out of our bodies, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of us, we didn't get this. But for the future generations, or for people who are parents on the call, what are some ways that they can start to help their children connect with their feelings and express them without making it about, self-hatred or blaming another person?
it's what you're saying. It's allowing it to be there. So my 7-year-old, she's got a temper, and what we probably learned when we had a temper tantrum was to be quiet, to go to our rooms, right, and stop it. I'm not advocating for, aggression or anything like that. But when a child who doesn't know how to regulate their nervous systems yet has a strong emotion and a lot of energy running through their body, they're going to like throw themselves on the ground, and they're going to go like this with their hand, and they're going to wail, because we do get energy out through the body. So through vocalizing and through actions and through movement. So when my daughter is doing that, I make sure that, she's not hurting anyone else. And and I sit there near her and I let her have the time and space to get it out of her body. And each and every time she wears herself out. And when she does, I'm like, do you want to talk? Or I'm here. And I just kind of stay present. And I think that there's something about not interrupting the body's natural process of going through the emotion, but being present without judgment throughout that. And of course, this is very scripted, so the nice way to tie it in a bow, but I think doing this for ourselves too, of like, how do I tolerate an emotion without judging it and let it cycle through? And then at the end, how might I be able to have a conversation about that, or help my child have a conversation about that to help her understand what you just dealt with was a cycle of activation. I mean, I'm not going to say it like this, but that was an emotion that like peaked, had a crest and fall, and it's okay. You're not in trouble for that. And I can help you move that through, and I can wait for you to move that through, and then we can have a conversation so that it has a safe ending.
I love that. It's so funny when you were saying that, I have a 7-year-old, and it was the 11-year-old actually that was having the problem last night. And it's almost like the younger we are, the more naturally this all happens.
Yeah.
Right? We're just like angry, we're screaming, we're shouting, and then we're like, all right, I'm better. And we just go on with our day, and I just needed to get that out of him.
Had it right.
Yeah, exactly. And then we get it beaten out of us. And then as adults, we're just like, don't be angry. Don't be rageful. Don't be resentful. And we just bottle it up inside.
Right.
It's so sad to me.
That keeps coming up. Like every episode, we talk about how far we get away from childhood and some of the things that were just innately healthy.
Yes.
We're told we're not. Like, we were intuitive eaters as children. Like,
right.
You know what I mean? We expressed our emotions probably fairly normally as children, and
we love to move.
Yeah, we love to move. We played. We got on the floor. So it's just amazing now as, 40-something-year-olds. It's like, all right, let's go back to that.
Yeah, right. We're coming back around.
It's like, wait, what? So I love that. This has been a really, really good conversation. I would love for our audience to know how they could connect with you. And so if you could just share the best places to find you and work with you.
Sure. I am on Instagram, and I have a website. They're both I am Stefanie Michele. I spell Stephanie with an F and Michelle with one L. So my parents made that really easy. They could tell I was getting to go on social media. And I also have a podcast called Life After Diets.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our listeners, Stefanie. This is an amazing conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.